What could the government do about those excluded from the self-employment income support scheme? The government has provided a massive amount of financial support to employees and the self-employed since the start of the pandemic last March. The word unprecedented is often bandied around. But despite the anticipated £62.5 billion cost of the furlough scheme and the £28 billion cost of the self-employment income support scheme, we know there are millions who fell through the cracks. These are the excluded, and despite numerous calls for further financial support, to date the government has left them on the sidelines. Today I'm looking at a briefing note from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. I'll link to it in the description. It asks two pertinent questions. Who is excluded from the government's self-employment income support scheme, and what could the government do about it? Let's start with some of the basics before moving on to some of the suggestions. The Self-Employment Income Support Scheme, the SEISS, it broadly mirrors the furlough scheme for employees. It covers 80% of pre-pandemic profits up to a cap of £7,500 per quarter. The scheme is open to eligible self-employed people who have been adversely affected by the pandemic, but a lot of self-employed people found themselves ineligible, and it's these excluded that this briefing note is concerned with. It sets out what the IFS knows about those who have been excluded from the SEISS and what options the government has, with a little over a month to go until the budget, when it comes to extending the scheme to cover the excluded. Let's look through their key findings together. First up, the IFS says that the government's self-employment income support scheme, the SEISS, is a generous form of income support for those who are eligible for it. They note that it's been paid to at least 2.6 million self-employed people to date, costing the taxpayer £21 billion up to the end of this month. According to their research, at least 3/4 of potentially eligible self-employed people have taken advantage of the scheme. That's compared to 30% of employees who were benefiting from the furlough scheme at its peak last May, so a dramatically larger uptake for the self-employment grants compared to the furlough scheme. However, the IFS also notes that around 1.8 million self-employed people and around a further 700,000 company owner-managers are ineligible for grants through this scheme. For some of these excluded people, the IFS says that it is technically very difficult for the government to provide targeted support. And the IFS here is referring to two groups really, owner-managers and newly self-employed people. Those are two groups currently excluded from the grant scheme. But they say it's not technically very difficult to include the 1.3 million self-employed people who currently fall foul of what is known as the 50-50 rule. That means they have less than half of their income coming from self-employment. Another excluded group where it's not technically difficult for the government to include them are the 225,000 self-employed people with profits exceeding £50,000 a year. This is another excluded group, one which the government has actively chosen to exclude from the support scheme. The IFS says there are clear injustices in the way these people are excluded, not least in the hard cut-offs, which means someone with profits of £50,000 can claim the maximum available, while someone with £50,001 can claim nothing. There's another hard cut-off, and that's where someone with 51% of declared income from self-employment can claim the maximum, while someone with 49% can claim nothing at all. In some cases, £1 of declared income can make the difference between being eligible or ineligible for the grants. They say in the briefing note that more than half of self-employed people with less than 50% of their income from self-employment have total personal incomes of under £25,000. That means that if the government chooses to target support at this particular group, it would affect a large number of people with low or moderate income levels. The IFS notes that this group also have relatively low levels of self-employment profits, with more than half of the group declaring profits of less than £5,000 a year. 45% of this group of excluded people are women, compared to 35% of those currently eligible for the self-employment income support scheme. What's more, extending the scheme to this group would be relatively cheap for the taxpayer. The IFS has calculated it would only cost between £500 million and £800 million per quarter, with average quarterly payments of £600 to £1,000 per person. Turning then to self-employed people with profits exceeding £50,000 a year, this group has, on average, very high overall incomes. More than half of this excluded group have incomes between £50,000 and £100,000, and some, according to the IFS, will have much higher incomes. Despite their higher incomes in this subset of excluded self-employed people, the IFS concludes that denying support to them entirely creates a clear unfairness for people who earn just over £50,000 compared with those earning just under. They also point out that there's an inconsistency with how the furlough scheme works for employees. If the government decided to fully extend the self-employment income support scheme to this excluded group of higher earners, it would cost an estimated £1.3 billion each quarter, with a payment of £7,500 per person. However, the government could choose to taper support to this group of higher earners, making support available only to those with profits of between £50,000 and £100,000. That approach would cost much less, an estimated £350 million per quarter. If the government decided to fully support self-employed people who currently fall foul of the 50-50 rule and provide some support to higher earners with income of between £50,000 and £100,000, it would cost the government around £1 billion a quarter. To put that in context, that is around 5% of the cost of the SEISS to date, or around 1% of the combined cost of the SEISS and furlough schemes to date. £1 billion is a lot of money, but relative to the government financial support already provided, it's not very much. It would also no doubt save the government some costs in welfare benefit payments too. The IFS concludes its briefing note by saying, "It is hard to believe it would be significantly less well targeted than the current SEISS, and it would certainly support a significant number of people facing financial difficulties." What do you think of this briefing note and the proposed solution to helping some, but not all, of the excluded self-employed? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. Until next time, I'm Martin Bamford, and remember, when it comes to your money, the more you know, the faster it can grow.